Welcome to this third episode in the series of Recovering from Alcoholism in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. And with me today I have Andy.
Hi George, how are you?
Good to see you here, welcome.
Good to be here.
We're going to talk about sponsorship and sponsors in today's episode. What is a sponsor?
A sponsor in AA is someone that has been in AA for some time and is in a position to offer guidance, help and support to a newcomer and guide them towards a comfortable sobriety.
So this senior member of AA, which is a sponsor, what's his role?
A sponsor's role in the very early days, I think, is just to be a friend, a support system, a mentor, and someone that can just offer a hand of friendship in the very early days of sobriety. That changes later on.
Do you find a sponsor directly when you enter into the first AA meeting?
A lot of people find a sponsor straight away when they come to AA. For me personally, that has been a mistake. I have found it much better to wait, to be patient, and to find the right person to ask for sponsorship, and even ask other members of the group if the person that I'm thinking of asking is competent and well enough to sponsor me.
So is it really essential to have a sponsor? It has been a tradition since AA started in 1935.
I think it's absolutely essential eventually to have a sponsor. I didn't have a sponsor. I didn't believe in sponsorship when I first came to AA. I thought that it was outrageous to ask another alcoholic to guide me in my life. I was of the opinion that only therapists and counselors were in a position to help me, so I was very intolerant and dismissive of the whole concept of sponsorship, and I ended up paying a very high price for this mistake.
So what advice would you give to a newcomer looking for a sponsor?
I would say to wait, to be patient, and to shop around the meetings until you find the person that really feels right for you. This is a decision that is best made through your intuition rather than your head. You have to intuit if that person is going to be right for you to help you through the program.
Can a new member go through the 12 steps here without a sponsor? Can you do it by yourself?
It's absolutely impossible in my experience to go through the 12-step recovery journey without a sponsor. The steps are very specific in the way that they're presented in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's quite simply impossible to go through them without the help of someone that has been through them with their sponsor.
So a newcomer comes to AA and goes through the step, maybe some big book studies. So what would you say about big book study groups that are set up to go through this step?
I have done 2 big book studies in my time in AA, and I have to say that they were both very helpful, but you don't get the personal relationship from a big book study that is so important to really recover from the alcoholic illness. It's really important that you enter into a relationship with one other person that will support you and guide you when you start making mistakes.
So I understand sponsee and sponsor is a very unique relationship. It doesn't cost any money. The sponsors gain from it as well as the sponsee. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. The whole AA program is based on maintaining our own sobriety by helping other people. It's all about getting out of our self-centered alcoholic personalities, reaching out and helping someone that needs the help. It's a very unique relationship, and if it's done properly, it helps both the sponsor and the sponsee.
We're coming back to that a little bit later. How many sponsors have you had in the 37 years you've been going to AA?
Well, I'm not proud to admit that in my 37 years of going to meetings, I've had about 20 sponsors. The reason for that is because I was a serial relapser for my first 13 years in AA, and unfortunately whenever I relapsed, my sponsor would usually end up letting go of me. So when I came back from the relapse, I would have to find another sponsor, and I got through about 20.
So a sponsor can fire you?
Oh yes.
Can you fire a sponsor?
Of course you can. Of course you can. If you're not comfortable with the way that the sponsor is behaving towards you or treating you, then you're perfectly at liberty to walk away.
And you can never go back to the same guy again? Or?
It's entirely up to you, but if you leave a sponsor once, then the chances are that you're not going to work well together.
Is a big book study group enough to maintain this long-term sobriety that you wish for?
I don't think so. I don't think so. They're very, very helpful, and I gained a lot from the big book studies that I've attended, but it's not enough. You really need the personal relationship of a sponsor.
Can we compare it with a therapist, or what is the sponsors actually? So can you explain a little bit?
Some people in AA treat their sponsors like therapists. They go to their sponsors with their emotional and psychological problems, if they're suffering from depression or anxiety, or they've got specific issues going on in their marriages or in their relationships. That ultimately, a sponsor can be supportive in these areas, but ultimately it's not the sponsor's role to try and be a counsellor or a therapist. The sponsor's role is to quite simply guide the sponsee through the first 9 steps of the program.
So I guess you have found a lot of different characters as sponsor, as sponsees as well. Do, for example, a fundamentalist sponsor?
Well, there is something in AA which is seen as hardcore fundamentalist AA, and the ethic of these groups, these fundamentalist groups, is a very strict sponsorship ethic, where you simply follow the sponsor's suggestions without question and do exactly what's suggested. And these fundamentalist groups believe that this is a very sure way to a successful sobriety.
So you have to obey to your sponsor and do as he tells you?
Well, obey is a strong word, but I suppose in a way that is what it is. You follow suggestions. I remember going to a meeting once when I was a member of such a fundamentalist group in London, and someone shared in the meeting humorously about the character that started these meetings, a guy called David B. And he said about David that David gives orders disguised as suggestions, which I thought was really funny.
So, okay. So should the sponsor have an ongoing relationship or friendship with the sponsor, with the sponsee?
Initially, it's not a friendship. Initially, it's not really a friendship. The sponsor is friendly, supportive and kind, but it isn't a personal friendship. The sponsor's role is more of a teacher or a mentor to guide the sponsee through the 12-step recovery journey.
Stupid question. For how long do you need a sponsor?
Well, every sponsor has a different opinion about this. My present sponsor offered me to end our sponsor-sponsee relationship when I completed my 9th step. He said that the program was now completed and that it was my responsibility to continue working the maintenance steps. I personally told him that I gained so much from our relationship that I wanted to keep him on as a sponsor after my step 9, and I still have him as a sponsor 10 years later.
So why is the sponsorship so important and considered the cornerstone of a successful recovery from alcoholism?
Because a successful recovery from alcoholism is contingent on a complete surrender to the suggestions of AA as outlined by Bill Wilson, one of the founder members of AA, in our basic text known as the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. In that book, he outlines in chapters 5 and 6 the program of action as suggested, and this, in my experience, is the only way to recover from the disease of alcoholism. And when I say the disease of alcoholism, I'm not only talking about our physical dependence on alcohol. In AA, we believe that alcoholism is a threefold illness: physical, mental, and spiritual. Going to AA meetings is very good at helping us to stay sober and abstinent from alcohol, but only the 12 steps can help us to recover from the other two aspects of the disease, which is the mental and the spiritual part of the disease.
Do you believe alcoholism is a mental disease?
I certainly believe that. In fact, for myself, I know it to be a mental illness. I was so thought disordered in my early days of sobriety, after 20 years of very self-destructive drinking, that I was unable to think clearly or positively. I was full of fear and anxiety, very angry. My thoughts dominated me and not the other way around. And if I am thought disordered in that way, to the degree that I was thought disordered, I can only describe that as a mental illness.
And a spiritual illness as well, maybe?
My spiritual illness was characterized by my dishonesty and the amount of resentment and blame that I had towards other people for the problems that I experienced in life. It was really my complete inability to be honest with myself or with anybody else that I believe was that characterized my spiritual illness. My life was a lie. All the resentments that I had made me very negative and very unwell, so I couldn't describe myself as someone who was spiritually or psychologically well adjusted.
Could you, as a male member of AA, have a female sponsor and opposite?
It has happened, and I've even heard that these relationships can sometimes be successful. It's a very rare thing in AA that a male has a female sponsor or that a female has a male sponsor. It does happen. My own sponsor sponsors women. It's because he has absolutely no agendas regarding any sexual intrigue between his female sponsees, but it's very rare that it's successful. On the whole, it's best that the men stick with the men and the women stick with the women.
It could be a risk otherwise.
It's a risk. It's a risk that it will develop into some kind of a sexual intrigue, and that harms the recovery journey from alcoholism and the spiritual healing that is absolutely central to the recovery journey.
Can you as a sponsor give advice of everything, or is it some cases you should decline?
I have learned over the years that if I don't have any personal experience about an issue that I've struggled with in the past, I should not offer advice to a sponsee about an issue that I have no experience about. This has happened to me occasionally, and I have learned through my own sponsor has taught me, actually my own sponsor has taught me, that it's best to refer a sponsee to someone else if I don't have any personal experience about an issue that they are struggling with.
Sex and relationships goes hand in hand with the disease of alcoholism. Should sponsors give advice on that as well?
Only if they have personal experience. If they have no personal experience, they should refer the alcoholic to someone that does have experience, or better still, to a 12-step fellowship that is designed to deal with sex and love addiction like SLA, which is an abbreviation for Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. This is a very helpful program for alcoholics that struggle also with sex and love addiction.
So if sex is very troublesome for a sponsee and is clearing having a negative effect on his or her recovery, the sponsor might not want to advise in this situation.
If they have no experience, then probably not. But my advice would be to reach out to 12-step fellowships, as I've said, like SA, which is SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous, or SLA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous.
I'm looking at the AA Big Book here on page 68. It says how it works. Is there any advice given in the Big Book if a newcomer's sex life is very troublesome?
Yes, there is actually some very good advice that Bill gives, in the Big Book about what to do if sex is very troublesome for the recovering alcoholic. The advice given is starts on page 68 and goes to the end of the chapter on page 71. There, Bill offers some extremely sound and good advice on how to cope if sex is very troublesome for an alcoholic in recovery.
It's a bit confusing here. Why does sex go, or problematic sex addiction, why does it go hand in hand with alcoholism?
In AA, Bill Wilson describes in the Big Book alcoholism as a spiritual malady. Malady is an old word, but I prefer to call it a spiritual illness. This spiritual illness is characterized by feelings of inner emptiness and a very poignant loneliness that are symptoms of the spiritual emptiness, the spiritual illness as described by Bill. Very often when an alcoholic puts down the alcohol and begins recovery, he tries to grasp some other way of filling that inner emptiness and dealing with the poignant loneliness by reaching out for other addictive behaviors. Very often those behaviors are through compulsive, obsessive addiction to sex.
And I understand also if you stop drinking alcohol and join the program, it could happen that you change the drug of choice, not alcohol. You might start other things.
Well, I personally believe that for me, I was also a sex and love addict in recovery. For me, my sex and love addiction was merely a substitute for my alcohol and drug addiction.
Here in the Big Book, Into Action on page 84, it says, love and tolerance of others is our code. What would you say about AA members trying to practice these qualities in their family?
What I would say to a newcomer, particularly a newcomer that is looking for a sponsor in AA, is to bear in mind this very important statement that Bill makes in chapter 6, love and tolerance of others is our code. If a sponsor is not able to display these two fundamentally important qualities in the sponsor-sponsee relationship, then it's not a spiritual relationship, and I wouldn't be surprised if the relationship broke down after a while. There has to be love and tolerance between sponsor and sponsee for the relationship to work.
You mentioned you have had several sponsors. How many sponsees have you had and managed?
I haven't had that many sponsees, but probably over the years about 6 or 7.
How many have you fired?
I haven't fired any sponsee. They have normally fired me.
Why?
Because they didn't want to do the work of the steps.
You mean they didn't want to do the steps and do the program?
I was taught to do the steps through written assignments. Each step was a written assignment, and I found this process of writing the steps most helpful to my recovery. Some of my sponsees just didn't want to do the work. Either they just didn't want to do the written work, or they were afraid to look at themselves by doing the written work, and they normally cut me loose.
Have you ever had negative experience with sponsors, and can you tell us a little bit what happened?
I have had some negative experience with sponsors. When I was in my early recovery, one of the symptoms of my untreated alcoholism was that I was very reckless, impulsive and impatient. I wanted solutions to my inner turmoil, and I wanted them as quickly as possible. This sometimes caused me to make a mistake in asking someone for sponsorship before I had an opportunity to learn more about them and to check them out. And unfortunately, I've had sponsors that were very unhelpful, and they were aggressive, they were bullies, they had enormous egos, which is actually diametrically opposed to what the program is supposed to achieve. The program is supposed to achieve humility in the alcoholic and not arrogance, aggression, or a huge ego. And I have had negative experiences with sponsors that have been actually quite damaging to my recovery. Thank God that I have learned over the years the gift of discernment and how to discern someone who is competent to be a sponsor and someone who is not competent to be a sponsor.
So what's the worst that can happen if you get a bad sponsor?
Some of the more fundamentalist sponsors are usually sponsoring for the wrong reasons. They're sponsoring to make themselves feel better about themselves, to inflate their egos even more rather than deflate their egos, which is what the 12 steps suggest. And they use sponsorship in a very exploitative way by getting into power trips over the sponsees and being abusive, aggressive, patronizing and condescending. This is not what sponsorship is about. It shouldn't be about any type of aggression or ego.
Are there any signs that a newcomer should look out for before making the mistake of asking someone with a personality disorder or whatever for sponsorship?
This is a very important question, and one that I think that I should answer quite accurately. Every now and again, I mean, people that come to AA sometimes have got problems other than alcohol. There are many people that come to AA with coexisting mental health issues. They come to AA with quite serious personality disorders. One of those personality disorders that is quite common in AA is the narcissistic personality disorder. The narcissistic personality disorder is an extremely destructive disorder for anybody who gets involved with a narcissist. As I've said, it can be very damaging to a vulnerable newcomer to get involved with someone that has narcissistic tendencies. It can take a newcomer a long time to get over an experience with a sponsor that has coexisting NPD. And very often their experiences have proved so negative that they end up leaving AA and not bothering to persevere with the program of recovery. This is a mistake because there's some very, very good sponsors in AA, people that are genuinely spiritually committed to their own growth in recovery, and their own growth is contingent on helping the newcomer and offering the 12 steps through love and tolerance and not through bullying, aggression or arrogance. This topic is so important because of the experience that I once had, that I think that it's important that the newcomer is aware of what to look for and what to look out for when asking for sponsorship. So I thought that it would be useful if I read out the diagnostic criteria of the narcissistic personality disorder that sometimes appears in AA. They are on the whole, when you first get to meet them, very charming people. They're very seductive people. They can lull you into a false sense of confidence that you've made the right choice when you've chosen them. But this is all a facade. And later on, as the relationship develops, the narcissistic tendencies begin to surface. And I'm going to read them out to you. There is a manual produced by the American Psychiatric Association known as the DSM-5. I think the 5th edition has just come out. It's known as the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and they identify NPD as a bona fide personality disorders, and each personality disorder has specific diagnostic criteria. So I'm going to read to you the diagnostic criteria of the narcissistic personality disorder, and actually what Wikipedia has to say about NPD. People with narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, are characterized by the personality traits of persistent grandiosity, an excessive need for admiration, and a personal disdain and lack of empathy for other people. As such, the person with NPD usually displays arrogance and a distorted sense of personal superiority, and seeks to establish abusive power and control over others. Self-confidence, a strong sense of self, is a personality trait different from the trait of NPD. Thus, people with NPD typically value themselves over others, to the extent of openly disregarding the wishes and feelings of anyone else, and expect to be treated as superior regardless of their actual status or achievements. Socially, the person with NPD usually exhibits a fragile ego, self-concept in brackets, intolerance of criticism, and a tendency to belittle other people in order to validate their own superiority. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, DSM-5, 2013, indicates that a person with NPD possesses at least 5 of the following 9 criteria, typically without possessing the commensurate personal qualities or accomplishments for which they demand respect and status. Here are the criteria. 1. Has a grandiose sense of self-importance, e.g. exaggerates achievements and talents, expects to be recognized as superior without commensurate achievements. 2. Is preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited power, success, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. 3. Believes that they are special and unique, and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status people or institutions. 3. Requires excessive admiration, has a sense of entitlement, unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or authentic compliance with their expectations, is interpersonally exploitative and takes advantage of others to achieve their own ends, lacks empathy, is unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others, is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of them, shows arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. So this is the diagnostic criteria of the narcissistic personality disorders. If you get someone like this as a sponsor, it could prove to be very damaging to your recovery, and you could relapse if you become involved with a person like this in AA. It is extremely important that you learn to exercise discernment and discrimination when asking for sponsorship. Don't do what I did, which was to just impulsively ask the first person that came along for sponsorship. Asking someone for sponsorship is one of the most important decisions that you will ever make. It's as important as coming to AA in the first place. Therefore, you need to make a right decision, a discerned decision, a decision that will support you in your sobriety and not damage your sobriety.
Very interesting. And how do you socialize with your sponsor? Of course, you might meet in AA meetings. You may go out for a coffee or a dinner or a lunch, or just sit and chill out and talk together. How does the social...
A good sponsor will not encourage a personal friendship in early sobriety. Sometimes this happens, and it's not a very positive thing during the journey through the steps. Sometimes friendship develops after the sponsee has gone through the first 9 steps of the program, and then it usually becomes a lifelong and very satisfying friendship. But in the early days, a sponsor's role is not that of a real close buddy, it's that of a mentor to take you through the first 9 steps of the program. This kind of relationship offers boundaries, and I think that boundaries are necessary in the sponsee-sponsor relationship in the early days, so that the sponsee can focus on the steps and just get on with the suggestions offered by the sponsor.
Andy, what are the best things you ever done for yourself in terms of your recovery in AA?
Well, as I've said, the first and most important and very best thing that I ever did was to come to AA in the first place. That was undoubtedly the best decision that I ever made. I was someone that was going to die of alcoholism eventually, so coming to AA was a life-saving and totally creative choice. The second most important decision that I ever made, when I was ready and when I had relapsed for long enough and been hammered by my illness, by my untreated alcoholism, was to get a good sponsor and surrender to the guidance of that sponsor. I had to become teachable to the suggestions of this sponsor, and I had to trust that they had my best interests at heart. And the best thing that I ever did in recovery was to go through the first 9 steps of the AA program, and to this day I try to live in the maintenance steps, which are steps 10, 11 and 12, to ensure a happy and stable and contented sobriety.
Andy, you are writing a book about things here. Can you tell us about your project? Your book will be published later in 2021. What is it about?
My book is about, I have always identified as an agnostic member of AA, and there are very many.
So what is an agnostic?
An agnostic member of AA is someone who doesn't really understand what is meant by the expression God, and has great difficulties in believing in a higher deity to support them in their recovery. This is a shame, because recovery is possible for everybody. Every alcoholic that comes to AA can recover whether they believe in God or not. But it has presented serious difficulties for many atheists and agnostics because God, or a higher power, is mentioned in 6 of the 12 steps. My book is about the lessons that I've learned and the guidance that I've had from agnostic-friendly sponsors to show me how to recover from the alcoholic illness without the necessity of believing in God or an unseen higher power.
Can you tell us a little bit about the content of the book, some titles of the chapter, for example?
I share my own experience of recovery, the mistakes that I made. I share quite a lot about my 13 years of relapse in AA as an agnostic alcoholic. I share how the steps were shown to me and explained to me by agnostic-friendly sponsors in a way that I could use in a practical way, and in a way that I could understand without having to get too stressed out about the God word in the steps.
So how to get more information about your upcoming book? Is it on your website? Or?
Yes, there's more information about my book on my website, which is www.aaforagnostics.com.
And a Facebook page with the same name.
There's also a Facebook page with the same name, yes.
Thank you, Andy, for coming here today and share your experience. Very interesting discussion. I wish you good luck.
Thank you very much, George. It's always a pleasure to be here.